The pen was inches from the paper. That's all that separated a billionaire from losing everything he'd built over 30 years. His hand trembled so violently that the ink in the pen seemed to ripple, like it knew what was coming. Around him, 8 lawyers sat frozen, their eyes glued to the bankruptcy documents spread across the mahogany table. No one spoke. No one breathed. The air in that glass-walled conference room felt like it was made of lead. Thomas Brennan had built his empire from nothing. A kid from the South Side who'd worked construction jobs to pay for community college, who'd slept in his car while building his first tech startup, who'd clawed his way into boardrooms that didn't want him there. 30 years of 16-hour days. 30 years of sacrifice, of missed birthdays and lost relationships, of pouring every ounce of himself into something that mattered. And now, at 53 years old, it was all about to disappear with a single signature. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times over the past 3 weeks, but now that it was here, his body refused to cooperate. His throat was dry, like he'd swallowed sand. His chest felt tight, compressed, like invisible hands were squeezing the air from his lungs. The signature line sat there blank and waiting, like a grave with his name on it. The lawyers had told him there was no other choice. The debts were too massive. The creditors are too aggressive. The restructuring had failed. Every alternative had been explored and eliminated. This was it. Sign the papers, declare personal bankruptcy, lose the company, lose the houses, lose everything except a small allowance to survive on. Start over at 53 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a lifetime of failure hanging around his neck. His hand moved closer. The pen touched the paper. The ink began to flow. And then a voice cut through the silence like a knife through silk. "Sir, please don't sign that." Every head in the room snapped toward the door. A waitress stood at the edge of the conference room, still holding a silver tray with empty coffee cups balanced on it. Her uniform was simple, a black dress with a white apron, slightly damp from the kitchen. Her name tag said Emily in faded letters. Her face was pale, drained of color, but her eyes were locked on the documents spread across the table like she'd just seen a ghost rising from the grave. The head attorney, Gerald Morrison, shot to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the window with a thud. His face flushed red with fury, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working beneath his skin. "This is a private meeting," he barked, his voice sharp as broken glass. "You need to leave. Now. Immediately." His hand gestured toward the door with barely contained rage, like he was swatting away an insect that had dared to land on something precious. But Thomas didn't move. He sat there, frozen, his pen still hovering over the signature line, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. He stared at the waitress, really looked at her, and something in her expression made him pause. She looked terrified, absolutely terrified, her hands shaking so badly the cups on her tray rattled against each other. But beneath that fear, there was something else. Certainty, conviction. The kind of look someone has when they've seen something they can't unsee, when they know something they can't unknow. At that moment, she was the only person in the room who looked absolutely sure of anything. And Thomas, drowning in 3 weeks of doubt and despair and sleepless nights, found himself clinging to that certainty like a man overboard grabbing a rope. Have you ever felt so broken, so completely shattered, that even a stranger's voice made you pause and reconsider everything? Have you ever been on the edge of a decision that would destroy your life, and anyone, gave you a reason to stop? Drop a comment and tell me, would you have listened to her, or would you have signed anyway, just to end the pain? The room held its breath. Gerald Morrison stood by his chair, his face twisted in fury, his mouth open ready to shout again. The other lawyers sat frozen, some half rising from their seats, others staring at the waitress like she'd just announced the building was on fire. And Thomas, his hand still holding that pen, still touching that paper, found himself asking a question he never thought he'd ask. What mistake? His voice came out as barely a whisper, raw and broken, but in the deadly silence of that conference room, everyone heard it. And in that moment, everything changed. The waitress, Emily, didn't move from her spot by the door. Even with 8 pairs of eyes burning into her like lasers, even with Gerald Morrison's fury radiating across the room like heat from a furnace, she held her ground. Her knees felt weak, Her stomach twisted in knots, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to apologize and run. But she didn't. She couldn't, because she'd seen something that made her blood run cold, and she knew that if she didn't speak now, this man's life would be over. "There's a mistake," she said again, and this time her voice was stronger, clearer, though it still trembled at the edges. "A big one. A really big one." She took a step forward, the tray still clutched in her hands like a shield, like the only solid thing in a room that had suddenly become quicksand. Thomas Brennan's hand froze completely now. The pen hovered an inch above the signature line, suspended in space and time, caught between his past and his future. He wanted to dismiss her. God, part of him wanted to just sign the damn papers and end this nightmare. She was nobody. A woman in a stained apron who'd probably never seen a boardroom before today, let alone understood the complex legal maze of a corporate bankruptcy filing. What could she possibly know that 8 expensive lawyers had missed? But something in her tone, something in the way she said it with such absolute conviction, made him hesitate, made him wonder, made him hope. "What mistake?" he asked again, louder this time, his voice cutting through Gerald Morrison's sputtering protests. "Tell me, what mistake?" Gerald moved between them, his body language aggressive, territorial. "Sir, this is absolutely absurd. Completely inappropriate. She has no legal authority, no expertise, no business even being in this room during a confidential proceeding. I must insist that she leave immediately, or I'll have security remove her." His voice had that particular quality of condescension that expensive lawyers perfect over years of practice, the tone that says, "I know better than you, and if you disagree, you're an idiot. Let her speak." Thomas's words cut through the room like a blade, sharp and final. The command in his voice was absolute, the kind of authority that comes from 3 decades of running companies and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. It was the voice of the man he used to be, before 3 weeks of despair had hollowed him out. "Let her speak." Everyone went silent. The other lawyers exchanged glances, uncertain, uncomfortable. Gerald Morrison's face went from red to purple, but he stepped aside, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. Emily stepped closer to the conference table, her worn shoes silent on the expensive carpet. She set the tray down on a side table, her hands still shaking, and pointed to the document, to a single line buried in the middle of page 7. Her finger trembled as it touched the paper, leaving a small smudge on the pristine white page. "This clause right here," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This section, subsection C, paragraph 4. It says you're personally liable for the company's debts. All of them. Every single dollar. It makes you, Thomas Brennan, the individual, responsible for paying back everything the company owes." "Yes," Gerald interjected smoothly, his voice dripping with patronizing patience. "That's standard language in bankruptcy proceedings. Mr. Brennan signed personal guarantees on several loans, which means—" "But that's not true," Emily interrupted, and the boldness of cutting off a senior partner at Morrison and Associates made several lawyers gasp audibly. "That's not true anymore. It hasn't been true for 3 years. She looked directly at Thomas now, her eyes meeting his. "Your company was restructured as an LLC 3 years ago. I remember because it was in all the business news. You converted from a sole proprietorship to a limited liability corporation, specifically to protect your personal assets from company debts. That's the whole point of an LLC. That's literally what the limited liability part means." The room went cold, actually cold, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter and let all the warmth escape in a single rush. Emily continued, her fingers still on the document, her voice steady now despite her fear. "You shouldn't be signing this as an individual guarantor. The LLC structure means the company's debts belong to the company, not to you personally. Unless you violated the corporate veil somehow, which from what I've read about your business, you didn't. You kept personal and business finances completely separate. You followed all the rules, which means this document is making you liable for something that's not legally yours. They're making you sign away your personal assets, your house, your savings, everything you own, to pay for corporate debts that you're protected from." One of the junior lawyers, a young man named David Chun, who'd been sitting at the far end of the table, reached for the document with shaking hands. His face went pale as he scanned the page Emily had indicated, his eyes moving rapidly across the dense legal text. His lips moved silently as he read, and with each passing second, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something close to horror. "Oh my God," he whispered, so quietly that only the people nearest him could hear. Then louder, "Oh my God. She's right. She's absolutely right." If you're watching this and you believe that truth can come from most unexpected places, that wisdom doesn't always wear an expensive suit, that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see what everyone else misses, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is just getting started, and what happens next will blow your mind. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of where this goes. Thomas Brennan looked at Emily like she just pulled him back from the edge of a cliff, like she'd reached out and grabbed his hand just as he was about to fall into an abyss. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in short gasps, and his hand, still holding that pen, began to shake for an entirely different reason now. Not despair. Something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. But here's the question that no one in that room dared to ask out loud, the question that hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had noticed yet. If this was a mistake, a simple error in the paperwork, why didn't any of the 8 lawyers in this room catch it? Why didn't Gerald Morrison, a senior partner with 30 years of experience, see this glaring problem? Why didn't any of his associates, his paralegals, his entire legal team notice that they were about to make their client sign a document that would destroy his life unnecessarily? Or worse, so much worse, what if it wasn't a mistake at all? The silence in that conference room was deafening, oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Thomas Brennan's eyes moved slowly from Emily to Gerald Morrison, searching the senior partner's face for an explanation, for reassurance, for something that would make sense of what he'd just heard. But Gerald didn't speak. He just stood there rigid as a statue, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. The room felt like it was shrinking, the glass walls closing in, the air getting thinner. Thomas could hear his own breathing, ragged and uneven, could feel his pulse hammering in his temples. 3 weeks of meetings, 3 weeks of legal reviews, 3 weeks of his entire legal team, the best lawyers money could buy, poring over these documents, preparing him for this moment. And not one of them had caught this. Not one of them had noticed that they were about to make him personally liable for debts he was legally protected from. "Is she right?" Thomas asked, and his voice came out low and dangerous, the kind of voice that makes people step backward without realizing they're moving. "Gerald, look at me. Is she right?" The junior lawyer, David Chun, was still holding the document, his hands trembling so badly the pages rustled like autumn leaves. He flipped through the sections frantically, cross-referencing clauses, his face going from pale to ashen to the color of old newspaper. "Sir, I think she might be correct. This clause here, the personal liability provision, it's referencing your status as of 5 years ago, before the LLC restructuring. But the liability terms should have been updated when the corporate structure changed. This document is treating you as if you're still a sole proprietor, which you're not. You haven't been for 3 years. Another lawyer, Margaret Weiss, one of the associates who'd been silent throughout the entire meeting, reached for her laptop and started typing furiously. Her eyes scanned the screen, and Thomas watched as her professional composure cracked. "The restructuring documents are clear," she said, her voice tight. "The LLC was properly filed, properly maintained. All corporate formalities were observed. There's no piercing of the corporate veil. Mr. Brennan's personal assets should be completely protected from corporate liabilities. This bankruptcy document is wrong. It's fundamentally legally wrong." Thomas felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been compressed and locked down for 3 weeks. It wasn't a relief yet. It was too soon for relief. It was something rawer than that. It was doubtful. Suspicion. The first whisper of betrayal. He turned to Gerald Morrison, the man he'd trusted with everything, the man who'd guided him through every major legal decision for the past 7 years. "Gerald," he said slowly, carefully, like he was walking across ice that might break at any moment. "Why didn't you catch this?" Gerald's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in his eyes, something cold and calculating that was there and gone so fast Thomas almost thought he'd imagined it. "This is absurd," Gerald said, and his tone was clipped, professional, dismissive. "We've reviewed this document a dozen times. Multiple times. Every associate in this firm has looked at these papers. There's no error. She's misinterpreting legal language she doesn't understand. She's seeing complexity where there's only standard procedure." "But I'm not," Emily said, and her voice cut through Gerald's practiced dismissal like a hot knife through butter. She was still standing by the table, her hands no longer shaking, her fear transforming into something else, something harder. "I worked in a law office for 6 years. Morrison and Associates, actually. Your firm. Before I had to take this job." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Several lawyers straightened in their seats. Gerald's eyes narrowed dangerously. Emily continued, her voice gaining confidence with each word. "I was a legal assistant in the corporate division. I filed paperwork like this every day. Articles of incorporation, LLC conversions, bankruptcy filings, restructuring documents. I know what proper documentation looks like, and this isn't it. When I brought your coffee in earlier, when I set it down on that table, I saw the document lying open. I didn't mean to look. I wasn't trying to spy or anything, but I saw your name. Thomas Brennan. And I saw those words, personal guarantor and individual liability. And I knew something was wrong because I remembered your LLC conversion. It was big news in the business section 3 years ago. Tech mogul restructures empire for long-term growth. There were articles about it, analysis pieces about why it was a smart move. And the whole point, the entire purpose of that restructuring was to protect you from exactly this situation." Thomas's chest was tight. He couldn't breathe properly. He turned back to his legal team, and the question hung in the air like smoke from a building that was just beginning to burn. "Why didn't any of you catch this?" His voice was rising now, emotion breaking through the shock. 8 lawyers in this room. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. 3 weeks of meetings and reviews and preparations. And a waitress saw in 30 seconds what none of you noticed in 3 weeks. What would you do if the people you trusted most, the experts you'd paid a fortune to protect you, were the ones leading you off a cliff? Have you ever had that moment where you realized the people you relied on might be the ones betraying you? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how you'd handle this situation. Would you explode? Would you shut down? Would you start questioning everything? David Chun was staring at Gerald Morrison now, and there was something in his expression that Thomas had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of Thomas. Fear of his boss. "Mr. Morrison," David said carefully, like he was defusing a bomb. "Perhaps we should review the documents more carefully. Perhaps there's been an oversight." "There's no oversight," Gerald snapped, and for the first time, his professional mask slipped completely. His voice was sharp, angry, and defensive. "This woman has no idea what she's talking about. She's a waitress with some half-remember knowledge from a job she couldn't even keep. And you're all ready to throw away 3 weeks of work because she pointed at some text she doesn't understand." But Thomas wasn't listening to Gerald anymore. He was looking at Emily, really looking at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Her worn uniform, her tired eyes, the calluses on her hands from years of hard work, the quiet dignity in the way she stood her ground even though every powerful person in this room wanted her to disappear. And he realized something that made his blood run cold. She had nothing to gain from this. Nothing at all. No reward waiting for her. No promotion or payoff or benefit. She was risking her job, risking her safety, risking everything, just to tell him the truth. Which meant she was either crazy or she was the only honest person in this entire building. And looking at her face, at the conviction in her eyes, Thomas knew which one it was. "How do you know about the LLC restructuring?" he asked her quietly. "How do you remember it so clearly?" Emily's eyes dropped to the floor for just a moment, and Thomas saw something painful cross her face. "Because 3 years ago, I was the one who filed the paperwork for it," she said softly. "I was the legal assistant assigned to your account. I prepared the documents, I filed them with the state, and I updated all the records. I remember thinking at the time that it was a smart move, that you were protecting yourself and your family. And then 6 months later, my daughter got sick, really sick, and I had to take time off for her treatments, and the firm, your firm, Mr. Morrison, decided I wasn't committed enough to my career. So they let me go. And I've been working as a waitress ever since, try to pay the medical bills and keep a roof over our heads." The room went absolutely silent. The kind of silence where you can hear fluorescent lights humming, where you can hear your own blood rushing in your ears. Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. This woman had worked for his legal team. She'd filed his documents. She'd lost her job because she'd chosen to take care of her sick child. And now she was risking what little she had left to save him from a trap he hadn't even seen. As the silence stretched and thickened, as Thomas watched Gerald Morrison's face remain absolutely impassive and cold, he realized something terrifying, something that made his hands go numb and his vision tunnel. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe this wasn't an oversight or a mistake or an error that slipped through the cracks. Maybe, just maybe, someone had wanted him to sign this document. Someone had wanted him to be personally liable. Someone had wanted him to lose everything. And the question burning in his mind, the question that made his whole world tilt sideways, was simple and horrible. Why? And who? Gerald Morrison's face was stone. Not just calm or composed, but stone. Like something carved from granite and left to weather in the cold for 1,000 years. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't offer an explanation or an excuse or even a defense. He just stood there, his hands folded in front of him in a posture that somehow managed to be both relaxed and threatening at the same time, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an expression that could only be described as contemptuous patience. Like he was waiting for a child to finish a tantrum so the adults could get back to important business. But David Chun, the junior lawyer, still clutching the bankruptcy document, looked like he was about to be sick. His face had gone from ashen to greenish, and there was sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Sir, I really think we need to review this more carefully," he stammered, looking between Thomas and Gerald like a man caught between two oncoming trains. "I think we should probably get a second opinion on the liability clauses before we proceed with any signatures." Carefully. Thomas's voice exploded into the room like a gunshot, making several people jump in their seats. He was on his feet now, though he didn't remember standing, his hands flat on the table, his whole body shaking with an emotion that was equal parts rage and terror. "You think we need to be more careful? I was about to sign my entire life away. My house, my savings, my daughter's college fund, the inheritance I promised my mother before she died, everything. I was 30 seconds from putting my name on a document that would have destroyed me, that would have made me personally responsible for paying back $47 million in corporate debt that I'm legally protected from. And you think we need to be more careful?" His voice was raw now, breaking at the edges, 30 years of controlled professionalism shattering like glass. He turned to Gerald, and the look in his eyes was something none of the lawyers had ever seen before. "You told me this was the only option," Thomas said, and each word came out like he was pulling nails from his own flesh. "You sat in this room, you looked me in the eye, you put your hand on my shoulder like we were friends, like you cared, and you told me there was no other way. You said if I didn't sign today, if I didn't sign these exact papers right now, I'd lose everything by the end of the week. You said the creditors were closing in, that there were no alternatives, that bankruptcy was my only chance to salvage anything. You made it sound like you were saving me." Thomas's hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "How many times did we go over these documents? How many meetings? You walked me through every clause, every section, every paragraph. You explained the implications, the consequences, the process. You answered every question I had. You seemed so thorough, so careful, so concerned about getting everything right. And in all that time, in all those hours and hours of review, you never once mentioned that I was signing as an individual guarantor for corporate debts I'm protected from. You never once pointed out that this document was making me liable for something I'm not legally responsible for." The silence that followed was crushing. The other lawyers were staring at Gerald now, and Thomas could see the doubt creeping into their expressions, the questions forming behind their eyes. Margaret Weiss had stopped typing. David Chun had set the document down on the table like it was radioactive. Even the paralegal in the corner, a young woman who'd been silent throughout the entire meeting, was watching Gerald with an expression that was equal parts confusion and horror. Gerald's lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then finally he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, absolutely controlled. Sir, bankruptcy is complex. There are nuances to corporate law that can be difficult for non-specialists to fully grasp. There are circumstances and conditions and contingencies that affect liability structures. Sometimes what appears to be protection on paper isn't as ironclad in practice as people assume. The LLC structure doesn't provide absolute immunity from personal liability if there are questions about corporate formalities or commingling of assets, or don't. Thomas's hand slammed onto the table with such force that coffee cups jumped and pens rolled onto the floor. The sound echoed through the glass-walled room like thunder. Don't you dare talk to me about nuances. Don't you dare stand there and try to confuse this with legal jargon and technicalities. This woman, this waitress, Emily, she saw something in 30 seconds that you supposedly missed in 3 weeks. She walked into this room carrying a tray of coffee cups, and she caught an error that 8 lawyers overlooked. Does that sound like a complicated nuance to you? Does that sound like something that requires specialist knowledge to understand? Thomas stepped around the table, moving closer to Gerald, and there was something dangerous in his posture now. Or did you not miss it at all? Is that what's really happening here? You didn't overlook this. You didn't make a mistake. You saw it. You knew exactly what that clause said and what it meant, and you let me get right to the edge of signing anyway. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. The other lawyers exchanged glances, uncertain, uncomfortable, some of them starting to put pieces together in their own minds. Emily stood frozen by the table, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide as she realized what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just legal incompetence. This was something much darker. Gerald's expression finally changed. The professional mask, the careful neutrality, the practiced composure, all of it slipped away like ice melting off a window. And underneath was something cold, something calculating, something that made Thomas take an involuntary step backward. "Sir," Gerald said slowly, and his voice had changed completely, all the false warmth and concern stripped away. "If you don't trust me, if you don't trust my expertise and my judgment after 7 years of representation, then perhaps you should find new legal counsel. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with someone else handling your affairs." It was the smile that did it. Gerald smiled as he said those words, small and controlled and absolutely chilling. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't, the smile of someone holding cards they hadn't shown yet. And in that moment, Thomas understood. This wasn't about trust. This wasn't about competence. This was a threat. If this kind of story grips you, if you want to see where this goes, if you're sitting there right now thinking, what the hell happens next, then subscribe right now. Hit that button. Because I promise you, what's coming in the next part will blow your mind. This story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming, and you don't want to miss a single second of it. Thomas stared at Gerald Morrison, the man who'd guided him through mergers and acquisitions, through contracts and negotiations, through every major legal decision of the past 7 years. The man he'd trusted with his company's future. The man he'd paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect him. And he saw clearly for the first time what had been hidden beneath the surface all along. Gerald wasn't his lawyer. Gerald wasn't his advocate. Gerald was something else entirely. The room felt like it was tilting, like the floor was no longer solid beneath Thomas's feet, because he just realized something that made his blood run cold. His lawyer had been playing a different game all along, a game where Thomas wasn't the client. He was the target. And the stakes, the real stakes that nobody had told him about, were higher than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. The question was simple. Who was paying Gerald to destroy him? And how deep did this conspiracy really go? Thomas stared at Gerald Morrison, and in that moment, everything clicked into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle you'd been staring at for hours, suddenly resolving into a picture you wished you'd never seen. The rushed meetings over the past month, the sudden urgency, the way Gerald had insisted on moving forward quickly, pushing for immediate action, no delays, no second opinions. The pressure to sign immediately, today, right now, before the opportunity slipped away. The way every alternative solution, every possible path other than complete bankruptcy, had been dismissed without real discussion, waved away with confident assurances that it wouldn't work, or the creditors won't accept it, or you don't have enough time. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't even negligence. It was intentional, deliberate, carefully orchestrated. Someone had wanted him to sign this document. Someone had needed him to be personally liable for corporate debts that would take the rest of his life to pay off. Someone had planned for him to lose everything, to be destroyed so completely that he'd never recover. And his own lawyer, the man he trusted most, had been guiding him toward that cliff with a steady hand and a reassuring voice. "You wanted me to sign this," Thomas said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper, raw and broken, and filled with a kind of pain that went beyond anger into something deeper. "This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an error. You wanted me to be personally liable. You needed me to sign my life away." Gerald Morrison didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. The way he stood there completely still, completely calm, with that small, cold smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man who'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but didn't particularly care about because he'd already calculated all the angles and determined he'd get away with it anyway. Emily felt her stomach drop, felt the floor seem to fall away beneath her feet. She'd thought she was just pointing out a mistake, a simple error that anyone could make, a technical oversight in complex legal paperwork. But now, standing in this room, watching Thomas Brennan's face shift from confusion to realization to something that looked like heartbreak, she understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was betrayal. This was a conspiracy. This was someone systematically destroying another person's life, and she just stumbled into the middle of it while carrying a tray of coffee cups. The other lawyers in the room were starting to understand too. You could see it in their faces, the way their expressions shifted from confusion to shock to horror as they began to piece together what had really been happening. Margaret Weiss had gone pale, her hand covering her mouth. David Chun was staring at Gerald like he'd never seen him before, like his boss had just transformed into a stranger, or maybe into something worse than a stranger. The paralegal in the corner had tears in her eyes. "Who paid you?" Thomas asked, and his voice was shaking now with barely controlled rage. "Who's on the other side of this? Who benefits if I'm destroyed? Who wanted this badly enough to bribe my own lawyer to lead me into a trap?" Gerald straightened his tie with careful, deliberate movements, his expression shifting back to professional neutrality like he was pulling on a mask. "I think this meeting is over," he said calmly, as if they'd been discussing nothing more controversial than a contract dispute. "I'll have my office send over the necessary termination paperwork for our representation. You'll need to find new counsel to handle your affairs going forward. I'd recommend someone who's more aligned with your particular worldview." He turned toward the door, reaching for his briefcase, his team scrambling to gather their materials. Papers shuffled, laptops snapped closed, the sounds of retreat and escape. But Thomas wasn't done. Not even close. "Stop." The command came out like a whip crack, sharp and absolute, the voice of a man who'd spent 30 years running companies and commanding rooms full of people. It was the voice of someone who'd built an empire, and even if that empire was crumbling, the authority remained. "You're not leaving until you tell me who's behind this." Gerald paused, his hand on the door handle, his back to the room. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the command. And then slowly he turned. And for the first time since Emily had interrupted the meeting, his mask didn't just slip. It fell away completely. There was something dangerous in his eyes now, something cold and predatory that had been hidden beneath layers of professional courtesy and careful politeness. It was the look of someone who'd been pretending to be civilized, but was tired of the pretense. "You want to know who?" he said, and his voice was low and cold and absolutely devoid of any warmth or humanity. "You really want to know who's been circling your company like a vulture, waiting for you to fail? You want to know who's been positioning themselves to buy up your assets for pennies on the dollar once you're gone?" He took a step back toward the table, and several people instinctively moved away from him. Ask yourself who has the most to gain if you disappear, Thomas. Ask yourself who's been pushing you to expand too fast, to take on too much debt, to gamble on deals that didn't quite make sense. Ask yourself who's been whispering in your ear about opportunities and growth and taking risks, all while making sure those risks were just big enough to break you. Ask yourself who recommended me as your lawyer in the first place, who made the introduction, who assured you I was the best in the business. Thomas's face went white. All the blood drained from his cheeks in an instant, and he had to grab the edge of the table to keep from swaggering. Because he knew. The answer hit him like a physical blow, like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it stopped beating. "Marcus," he whispered. "Marcus Aldridge." His business partner. His friend. The man he'd known for 15 years, who'd been by his side through every major decision, every expansion, every challenge. The man who'd pushed him to acquire that tech startup last year, the one that had turned out to be worth far less than they'd paid. The man who'd encouraged him to take out those massive loans for the European expansion that had fallen through at the last minute, leaving them overextended and vulnerable. The man who'd called him 3 days ago, voice dripping with false sympathy and concern, telling him that bankruptcy was the honorable way out, that sometimes you had to accept defeat and start fresh, that it was better to cut your losses than to drag things out and lose even more. The same man who'd introduced him to Gerald Morrison 7 years ago, who'd vouched for him, who'd said, "Gerald's the best, you can trust him with anything, he'll take care of you like your family." Have you ever trusted someone completely, absolutely, with no reservations, only to realize they were playing you the whole time? Have you ever had that moment where your entire understanding of a relationship, of years and years of friendship and partnership, just shatters like glass? Drop a comment and tell me your story, because I need to know I'm not the only one who's been through something like this. Tell me how you survived it. Tell me if you ever trusted anyone again. Gerald's smile widened, and there was genuine amusement in it now, like he was enjoying watching Thomas put the pieces together. "Marcus Aldridge is a very clever man," Gerald said softly. "Very patient, very strategic. He's been planning this for 3 years, ever since you restructured into an LLC. That move protected you, made you too hard to destroy through normal means. So he had to get creative. He had to engineer a crisis big enough to make you consider bankruptcy, and then make sure that when you filed, you'd file in a way that destroyed you personally, not just the company. Because if you just lost the company but kept your personal assets, you'd rebuild. You'd start over. You'd come back. Marcus knows you well enough to know that. So he needed to make sure you lost everything. Completely. Permanently. No recovery possible. The room was spinning. Thomas couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight. "The European expansion," he said, his voice hollow. "The tech startup acquisition. The supplier contracts that fell through. The investors who pulled out at the last minute. That was all him. All of it." "Not all of it," Gerald admitted with a casual shrug. "Some of it was just bad luck, bad timing, the usual risks of doing business. But Marcus made sure to amplify every problem, to turn minor setbacks into major crises, to make sure you were always just unstable enough, just vulnerable enough, that one more push would send you over the edge. And then when you were drowning, when you were desperate, he made sure I was the one holding the life preserver. Except the life preserver had lead weights hidden inside it." Thomas's knees gave out. He collapsed into his chair, his hands covering his face, and for a moment he looked like he might actually break down completely. 15 years of friendship. 15 years of partnership and trust and shared dreams. And all of it had been a lie. All of it had been manipulation, preparation, setting him up for this moment. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was barely audible. "Why would he do this? We built this company together. We were friends. I trusted him with everything." Gerald collected his briefcase, straightening his already perfect suit. "Because Marcus Aldridge wants what you have, Thomas. He wants your company, your reputation, your position in the industry. But more than that, he wants people to forget that you were the one who built it all. He wants to be the visionary, the founder, the success story. And he can't be that as long as you're around. So he decided to erase you. Completely. And once you'd signed those papers, once you were personally bankrupt and broken and destroyed, he would have bought your company through a shell corporation for a fraction of its value, restructured it, and taken all the credit for its success. You'd be forgotten. A cautionary tale about a man who overreached and failed. And Marcus would be the hero who rescued a failing company and turned it around. And then Gerald walked out, his team following behind him like a retreating army, leaving Thomas Brennan sitting alone at that conference table surrounded by the wreckage of his trust, the ruins of his friendship, and the horrifying knowledge that the person he'd thought was saving him had actually been destroying him all along. Emily stood frozen by the door, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She'd thought she was saving one man from a simple mistake. She had no idea. She just exposed a conspiracy that went back years, that involved millions of dollars and calculated betrayal, and a level of cruelty she'd never imagined possible. But here's the thing that no one in that room realized yet, the detail that would matter most in the days to come. Gerald Morrison had made one critical error. He'd gotten cocky. He'd gotten comfortable. And he just confessed to conspiracy and fraud in front of witnesses. The question now was whether those witnesses would be brave enough to testify, and whether Thomas Brennan, broken and betrayed and on the edge of collapse, had enough strength left to fight back. The door closed behind Gerald Morrison and his team with a soft click that somehow sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to draw breath. Thomas Brennan sat at the head of that massive conference table, surrounded by the scattered papers of his near destruction, and he looked like a man who just survived a car crash, but wasn't sure if he was actually alive, or if this was some kind of purgatory he'd been dropped into without warning. His hands were shaking. Not the trembling of fear anymore, but something else. Rage. Pure incandescent rage that was building in his chest like a fire that had been doused with gasoline. 15 years. 15 years of partnership, of friendship, of building something together from nothing. He remembered the early days with Marcus Aldridge, working out of a cramped office that barely had room for 2 desks, surviving on coffee and ambition, and the absolute certainty that they were going to change the world. Late nights planning strategy, early mornings chasing investors, the celebration when they landed their first major contract, the way Marcus had been there for his divorce, for his mother's funeral, for every major moment of the past decade and a half. And all of it had been preparation. All of it had been Marcus studying him, learning his weaknesses, his blind spots, his vulnerabilities, getting close enough to know exactly where to strike when the time came. Thomas felt physically sick, his stomach churning with a mixture of betrayal and fury, and something that felt dangerously close to shame. How had he not seen it? How had he been so blind? Emily was still standing by the door, clutching her empty serving tray like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. She watched Thomas sit there, watched his face cycle through emotions too complex to name, and she felt completely out of her depth. She'd been a waitress serving coffee. Now she was somehow in the middle of a corporate conspiracy that involved millions of dollars and years of calculated betrayal. Her hands were still shaking, her heart was racing, and part of her wanted to just slip out the door and pretend this had never happened, go back to her simple life of taking orders and clearing tables and staying invisible. But she couldn't, because she'd seen his face when he'd almost signed those papers. She'd seen the despair, the resignation, the look of a man who thought he'd lost everything and was just going through the motions of surrender. And something in her, some stubborn core of decency that years of hardship hadn't quite managed to crush, wouldn't let her walk away. "Mr. Brennan," she said softly, and her voice seemed to break through whatever trance he'd fallen into. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "Sir, I know I can't even imagine what you're feeling right now. You need to act fast. If Marcus finds out you didn't sign those papers, if he finds out the plan fell apart, he's going to adapt. He's going to change strategy. You can't just sit here." Thomas nodded slowly, mechanically, like his body was moving, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're absolutely right." He reached for his phone with hands that still trembled, scrolling through his contacts with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "I need a new lawyer. I need someone I can trust, someone Marcus doesn't have connections to, someone who can help me figure out what the hell to do next." He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen, and then he looked up at Emily with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and devastation. "You just saved my life," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You understand that, right? If you hadn't spoken up, if you just walked away, if you'd stayed silent like you were supposed to, I would have signed those papers. I would have destroyed myself. I would have given Marcus everything he wanted, and I wouldn't have even known I was doing it." Emily felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. I couldn't watch you sign something that wasn't right. I couldn't stay quiet when I saw something wrong. My mom always told me that silence makes you complicit, that if you see injustice and you don't speak up, you're part of the problem. I know I probably just lost my job for barging in here, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. What's your full name? Thomas interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp and focused, like he was forcing himself back into executive mode through sheer willpower. Your full name, not just the Emily on your name tag. Emily Hartman, she said, confused. Why? Thomas was typing rapidly on his phone now, his jaw set with determination. Because I'm going to make sure you don't lose anything for doing the right thing. In fact, I'm going to make sure you're protected, because if Gerald and Marcus realize you're the one who derailed their plan, they're going to come after you. And I won't let that happen. I won't let them hurt you for saving me. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She hadn't thought about that. Hadn't considered that by speaking up, by pointing out that error, she might have made herself target. These were powerful people. Rich people. Connected people. People who apparently thought nothing of orchestrating elaborate conspiracies to destroy their business partners. What would they do to a waitress who'd gotten in their way? Thomas saw the fear cross her face, and his expression softened slightly. I'm going to protect you, he said firmly. I promise you that. But right now I need to move fast. I need to secure my assets, file injunctions, expose what Marcus and Gerald were trying to do before they can cover their tracks or destroy evidence. I need, he trailed off, rubbing his face with both hands. God, I need to figure out who else might be compromised. How deep does this go? How many other people in my company are working for Marcus? How much of my life has been manipulated? He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the conference room like a caged animal. 3 years. Gerald said Marcus has been planning this for 3 years, since the LLC restructuring. That means every major decision I've made in that time, every deal, every expansion, every hire, I have to question all of it. I have to figure out what was legitimate business and what was sabotage designed to weaken me. The European expansion that failed, was that bad luck or did Marcus sabotage it? The tech startup we acquired that turned out to be worthless, did we miss something in due diligence or did Marcus feed me false information? The suppliers who suddenly backed out of contracts, was that market forces or Marcus buying them off? Emily watched him spiral, saw the paranoia taking hold, the way betrayal poisons everything it touches. Mr. Brennan, she said, trying to keep her voice calm and steady even though her own heart was racing. You need to focus. One step at a time. First thing, new lawyer, someone trustworthy. Second, secure your assets. Make sure Marcus can't move against you financially. Third, gather evidence of what Gerald and Marcus did. You have witnesses. She gestured around the empty conference room. Those other lawyers who were here, they heard Gerald's confession. The junior lawyer, David, looked horrified. He might testify. Thomas stopped pacing and stared at her. You worked in a law office, he said slowly. You know how this works. You understand legal strategy. I was a legal assistant for 6 years, Emily said with a small, sad smile. I learned a lot before they decided I wasn't committed enough when my daughter got sick. I know how discovery works, how evidence chains work, what constitutes admissible testimony. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand the system. If you're hooked on this story and you want to see how it ends, if you're sitting there wondering what happens next and whether Thomas can actually fight back against people who've been planning his destruction for years, subscribe right now. Hit that button and make sure you don't miss a single moment of what comes next. Because I promise you, this story is about to get even more intense, and you need to see how Emily and Thomas navigate the absolute minefield their lives just became. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Emily Hartman, he said slowly, would you be willing to help me? Not as a waitress, as a consultant? An advisor? Someone who can help me navigate this nightmare and make sure I don't make any more catastrophic mistakes about who to trust. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Mr. Brennan, I don't have any credentials anymore. I'm not certified, I'm not. You saw in 30 seconds what 8 lawyers missed in 3 weeks, Thomas said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. You spoke up when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You're the only person in this entire building who told me the truth today. That's worth more than any credential. That's worth more than any degree or certification or professional accreditation. So please, help me figure out how to fight back. Help me survive this. Emily looked at him, This powerful billionaire who suddenly seemed smaller and more vulnerable than any person she'd ever met, and she realized she'd already made her choice the moment she'd said, "Please don't sign that." She was in this now, whether she liked it or not. The only question was whether she'd run and hide and hope Marcus and Gerald forgot about her, or whether she'd stand and fight and maybe, just maybe, help stop two men who thought they were above consequences. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll help. But we need to move fast, and we need to be smart about this. Because if Marcus finds out you didn't sign, if he realizes his plan failed, he's going to come for you harder than before. And this time he won't be subtle." But what Emily didn't say, what she was too afraid to voice out loud, was the thought that kept circling in her mind like a vulture. If these men were willing to orchestrate a years-long conspiracy to destroy Thomas Brennan's life, what exactly were they willing to do to the waitress who'd ruined everything? Emily left the conference room 30 minutes later, her mind spinning like a carnival ride that wouldn't stop, her hands still shaking from adrenaline and fear, and the surreal understanding that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Thomas had given her his personal phone number, had made her promise to call him immediately if anything unusual happened, if anyone approached her, if she felt unsafe in any way. He'd wanted to send her home in a car service, but she'd refused, insisting that showing up at her apartment building in a luxury vehicle would raise questions she couldn't answer and would draw exactly the kind of attention she didn't need. So she rode the subway home like always, clutching her bag against her chest, hyper-aware of every person in the train car, wondering if any of them were watching her, following her, reporting back to someone about where she was going and what she was doing. The paranoia felt ridiculous and terrifying in equal measure. She was a waitress. Nobody cared about waitresses. Nobody paid attention to women in stained uniforms carrying worn-out bags and counting their tips to see if they'd made enough to cover groceries this week. Except now, she was a nobody. Now, she was the woman who derailed a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. Now, she was someone who powerful men would consider a threat. The thought made her stomach churn with nausea. By the time she got home to her tiny one-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days about 40 years ago, it was almost 7 in the evening. Her daughter, Mia, was at her mother's place for the night, which was both a relief and a worry. Relief because Emily didn't have to explain why she looked like she'd been through a war zone. Worry because if something happened, if someone came after her, at least Mia wouldn't be here to see it. She dropped her bag by the door and leaned against the wall, letting herself slide down to sit on the floor, her back against the peeling wallpaper, her head in her hands. What had she done? What had she gotten herself into? She'd been trying to help, trying to do the right thing, and now she was caught in the middle of something that involved conspiracy and fraud, and men who apparently thought nothing of destroying people's lives to get what they wanted. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs, her thumb hovering over the decline button. It buzzed again, and again. Finally, with a deep breath that felt like it might be her last moment of normalcy, she answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, refined in the way that expensive education and years of practice create. It was also absolutely terrifying in its casual confidence. "Miss Hartman. Emily. May I call you Emily?" The man didn't wait for an answer. "My name is David Collier. I'm calling on behalf of a client who's very interested in speaking with you about the, incident that occurred this afternoon in the Morrison and Associates conference room." Emily's blood went cold. Her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles went white. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted, more frightened than she'd intended. "Of course you don't," the man said, and she could hear the smile in his voice and could picture him sitting in some expensive office with a view of the city, completely comfortable, completely in control. That's very wise. Discretion is such an admirable quality. But let's not waste each other's time with denials, shall we? We both know exactly what we're talking about. You were present at a meeting today. You made certain observations. You shared certain information that was, let's say, disruptive to an ongoing business arrangement. I pointed out a mistake in a legal document, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady and failing. That's all. There's nothing. And my client is prepared to be very generous in appreciation of your discretion going forward, David Collier continued, as if she hadn't spoken. We're talking about a substantial sum of money, Emily. Enough to change your life. Enough to make sure your daughter, Mia, is it? 8 years old, attends Roosevelt Elementary? Enough to make sure Mia has everything she needs. Good schools, good health care, a comfortable life. All you have to do is forget what you saw today. Forget what you heard. And if anyone asks if there are any legal proceedings, any depositions, any questions from investigators, you simply don't remember the details. It was a confusing situation. You were nervous. You might have misunderstood what was happening. Simple, easy, and very, very profitable for you. The mention of her daughter's name, her daughter's age, her daughter's school, hit Emily like a physical blow. She felt like she couldn't breathe, like the walls of her tiny apartment were closing in around her. How do you know? She couldn't finish the sentence. We know quite a bit about you, Emily, David Collier said, and his tone remained pleasant, conversational, like they were discussing the weather or lunch plans. We know you're a single mother working 2 jobs. We know you're barely keeping your head above water financially. We know your daughter had leukemia 2 years ago, that she's in remission now, but the medical bills nearly destroyed you. We know you lost your job at Morrison & Associates because you took too much time off for her treatments. We know you're 3 months behind on rent, that your landlord has been patient, but that patience has limits. We know you're one emergency away from losing everything. Emily felt tears burning in her eyes. Are you threatening me? Threatening? David Collier sounded genuinely surprised, even hurt. No, Emily. I'm offering you a choice. I'm offering you a way out of the financial nightmare you've been living in for the past 2 years. I'm offering you security, stability, and peace of mind. All for a very small price, your silence. And if I say no? Emily asked, though she already knew the answer, could feel it settling in her stomach like lead. The pleasant tone evaporated from David Collier's voice like morning mist burning off in harsh sunlight. Then let me be more direct. You're a single mother working 2 jobs to keep your daughter in school you can't afford, living in an apartment you're about to be evicted from, with a visa situation that, well, let's just say there are some questions about whether all your paperwork was filed correctly when you immigrated from Canada 10 years ago. It would be a shame if someone decided to look into that more carefully. It would be a shame if your employer received a complaint about theft or inappropriate behavior. Completely false, of course, but investigations take time, and employers don't like controversy. It would be a shame if your daughter's school received information that raised questions about your fitness as a parent, your stability, your ability to provide adequate care. These things have a way of snowballing, Emily. One complaint leads to an investigation, which leads to more scrutiny, which leads to more problems, until suddenly you're fighting battles on every front, and you have no energy or resources left to fight any of them. What would you do if helping someone, if doing what you thought was the right thing, put your whole life at risk? What would you do if powerful people threaten not just you but your child, the most precious thing in your world? Tell me in the comments, because I honestly don't know if I'd be brave enough to stand my ground. I'd like to think I would be, but when it's your child's safety on the line, when it's everything you've worked for hanging by a thread, how do you choose? Emily's hands were shaking so badly she had to press the phone between her shoulder and her ear. You can't do this, she whispered. You can't threaten people like this. I'm not threatening anyone, David Collier said, and his voice was pleasant again, like they'd just cleared up a simple misunderstanding. I'm simply outlining potential consequences of certain choices. I'm helping you understand the full picture so you can make an informed decision. So here's what's going to happen, Emily. I'm going to have someone deliver an envelope to your apartment tomorrow morning. Inside will be a check for $250,000 and a very simple non-disclosure agreement. You cash the check, you sign the agreement, you move forward with your life. You get Mia into a better school. You find a better apartment. You stop working yourself to death at 2 jobs. You give your daughter the life she deserves. Or you decline the offer, and you find out what happens when you stand in the way of people who have significantly more power, more resources, and more determination than you could possibly imagine. I need time to think, Emily said desperately. I can't just. You have until tomorrow at noon, David Collier said. The envelope will be delivered at 9 in the morning. You have 3 hours to make your decision. Sign the agreement and deposit the check, or tear it up and face the consequences. Those are your options. Choose wisely, Emily. Choose Mia. The line went dead. Emily sat there on the floor of her apartment, staring at her phone, and she realized she was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone processing difficult emotions, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who's absolutely terrified and has no idea what to do. She'd done the right thing. She'd spoken up when she saw something wrong. She'd helped someone who was about to be destroyed by people he trusted. And now those same people were coming after her, threatening her daughter, dismantling her life piece by piece because she dared to tell the truth. She thought about the $250,000. God, what she could do with that money. Pay off all her debts. Move to a better neighborhood. Give Mia a real childhood instead of his constant stress and struggle and fear. Take that money and disappear. Start over somewhere far away where Marcus Aldridge and Gerald Morrison and David Collier couldn't find her. But then she thought about Thomas Brennan's face the moment he'd realized his best friend had been systematically destroying him for years. She thought about the other people Marcus and Gerald would hurt if no one stood up to them, if no one exposed what they'd done. She thought about what kind of example she'd be setting for Mia if she took money to stay silent about injustice, if she taught her daughter that the right thing to do was whatever kept you safe and comfortable. And as Emily sat there on her apartment floor, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking, she realized something terrifying. Saving Thomas Brennan might have just destroyed her own life. But the question that would determine everything, the question that would define who she really was when everything was stripped away, was simple. Would she let them win? Or would she fight back even if it cost her everything? Emily didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David Collier's invisible face and heard his smooth voice describing exactly how they'd destroy her life if she didn't comply. She paced her tiny apartment until her feet ached, made coffee she couldn't drink, picked up her phone to call Thomas Brennan a dozen times before putting it back down. What could he do? What could anyone do against people who had unlimited resources and no conscience? At 3 a.m, she finally called him anyway. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert and sharp despite the hour. Emily? What happened? Are you okay? They threatened me, she said, and the words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in her desperation to get them out before she lost her nerve. Last night, someone called. David Collier. He said he represented client. He didn't say who, but we both know it was Marcus. He offered me money to stay quiet, a lot of money, $250,000. And when I didn't immediately agree, he threatened me. He knew everything about me. My daughter's name, her school, my immigration status, my financial situation, everything. He said if I didn't take the money and sign a non-disclosure agreement, they'd come after me. After Mia. They'd make complaints to my employers, investigate my visa paperwork, and report me to child services. They'd destroy my life piece by piece until I had nothing left. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Thomas spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. Where are you right now? Home. My apartment. Mia's at my mother's place. She's safe. But Emily's voice broke. I don't know what to do. They're sending someone to deliver the agreement this morning at 9. I have until noon to decide. Sign it and take the money or refuse and watch them dismantle my entire existence. Pack a bag, Thomas said immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Right now, you and your daughter. Pack enough for several days, maybe a week. I'm sending a car to your apartment in 20 minutes and another car to your mother's place to pick up Mia. You're not staying there. You're not safe. I can't just leave, Emily protested, though even as she said it, she knew it was useless. I have work tomorrow. I have bills to pay. I can't just disappear. Yes, you can, Thomas said firmly, with absolute conviction. Listen to me, Emily. You saved my life this afternoon. You stopped me from signing papers that would have destroyed me completely. You exposed a conspiracy that's been 3 years in the making. You did that knowing you'd get nothing out of it, knowing you might lose your job just for speaking up. And now Marcus and Gerald are threatening you because you're the one person who can testify to what really happened, who can expose what they tried to do. If you think they're going to stop at threats, if you think they won't actually follow through on destroying your life, you're wrong. These are men who orchestrated a years-long plan to systematically dismantle a multi-million-dollar company. They're not going to let a waitress stand in their way. Emily sank down onto her couch, her legs too shaky to hold her up anymore. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why do you care what happens to me? You don't even know me." "Because you're the only person who told me the truth when it mattered," Thomas said, and his voice was raw with emotion. "Because I know what it's like to be backed into a corner by people who think they're untouchable, who think their money and power make them immune to consequences. Because you shouldn't have to choose between doing the right thing and protecting your daughter. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. So please, let me help you. Let me keep you safe while we figure out how to fight back." Emily closed her eyes, and she felt more tears sliding down her cheeks. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll pack a bag. But Thomas, I'm scared. I'm really, really scared." "I know," he said quietly. "So am I." The car arrived exactly 20 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who looked like he'd spent time in the military. Emily threw clothes into a duffel bag with shaking hands, grabbed her daughter's favorite stuffed animal and some books, and took a photo of her and Mia from the refrigerator. She left a note for whoever came to deliver that envelope. "I don't want your money, and I won't be silenced." Her hand shook as she wrote it, but she forced herself to tape it to the door anyway. By the time they picked up Mia from her mother's place, confused and sleepy and clutching her backpack, it was almost 5 in the morning. Emily held her daughter close in the back seat of the SUV, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, trying not to let Mia see how terrified she really was. "Mommy, where are we going?" Mia asked, her voice small and worried. "Is something wrong?" "We're going somewhere safe, baby," Emily said, forcing her voice to stay calm and steady even though everything inside her was screaming. "We're going to stay with someone for a little while, someone who needs our help. It's going to be an adventure, okay? Like a vacation." "But what about school?" Mia asked. "And what about my friends?" "We'll figure it out," Emily promised, though she had no idea if that was true. "I promise, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." They were taken to a private estate outside the city, surrounded by iron gates and security cameras and guards who checked IDs before letting anyone through. The house, if you could call something that size a house, was enormous, all glass walls and modern architecture and expensive furniture that probably cost more than Emily made in a year. Thomas met them at the door, and he looked different now. Less broken, more focused, like he'd spent the night transforming his despair into determination. "You're safe here," he said as he led them inside, past the marble foyer, and into a living room that could have fit Emily's entire apartment inside it twice over. "I've hired a security team. Ex-military, the best in the business. No one's getting through those gates without authorization. No one can touch you here." Emily nodded, though her hands were still shaking, though she couldn't quite make herself believe it. Mia stared around the house with wide eyes, taking in the chandeliers and the artwork and the staircase that looked like something from a movie. "Mommy, is this a castle?" she whispered. "Something like that," Emily said, managing a weak smile. "Why don't you go explore a little bit? Stay inside, okay? Don't go outside." If you believe that one brave voice can change everything, if you're watching this story unfold and wondering how regular people stand up against powerful enemies, hit subscribe and stay with this story. Emily's courage just set off a chain reaction no one saw coming, and what happens next will determine whether truth and justice can actually win against money and corruption. Don't miss a single moment of this. Over the next 3 days, Thomas worked around the clock like a man possessed. He hired a new legal team, not from any of the big firms where Marcus might have connections, but from a smaller practice known for taking on powerful defendants and winning. He hired forensic accountants to go through every transaction his company had made in the past 3 years, looking for evidence of sabotage and fraud. He hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Catherine Rodriguez, to build a case against Marcus and Gerald. And piece by piece, thread by thread, they uncovered the conspiracy. The falsified reports that had made the European expansion look more promising than it was. The bribed officials who delayed permits and approvals until opportunities passed. The manipulated financial statements that had made the tech startup acquisition seem like a good investment. The offshore accounts where money had been funneled, payments made to ensure key people looked the other way at critical moments. Marcus Aldridge had been thorough. He'd spent 3 years building this trap, making sure every piece was in place, every loose end tied off. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd gotten too confident. He'd assumed Thomas would never question him, would never look beneath the surface, would never have reason to doubt the friendship they'd built over 15 years. And that confidence had made him sloppy in small ways, leaving trails that a good investigator could follow if they knew where to look. Emily watched Thomas transform over those 3 days. The broken man from the conference room disappeared, replaced by someone harder, sharper, absolutely focused on one goal: exposing what Marcus and Gerald had done and making sure they faced consequences. She helped where she could, her legal assistant background coming back as she organized documents, flagged inconsistencies, made connections that others missed. At night, after Mia was asleep, she and Thomas would sit in his study and go over everything they'd found, building the case piece by piece. "Why did you really do it?" Thomas asked her one night, around 2 in the morning, both of them exhausted but too wired to sleep. "Why did you speak up? You could have just walked away. Served the coffee, went back to the kitchen, pretended you hadn't seen anything. No one would have blamed you. No one would have even known." Emily was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her answer. "My mom used to tell me this story," she finally said, "about when she was young, in her 20s, working as a nurse. She saw a doctor making a mistake during a procedure, something that could have killed the patient. And she was just a nurse, and he was this important surgeon, and everyone told her to stay quiet, to not make waves, to remember her place. But she spoke up anyway. She stopped the procedure. She probably saved that patient's life. And the doctor had her fired for it, reported her to the medical board, and tried to destroy her career. It took her 2 years to find another job, and we barely survived that time. I was just a kid, but I remember how hard it was." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "I asked her once if she regretted it, if she wished she'd just stayed quiet and kept her job. And she looked at me and said, 'Emily, you can lose everything in this world. Your job, your money, your home, your reputation. But the one thing they can't take from you is who you are.' And I'm not the kind of person who watches someone die because I was too scared to speak up. That's what I thought about when I saw you about to sign those papers. I thought about my mom, and I thought about what kind of person I want to be, what kind of example I want to set for Mia. And I realized I couldn't just walk away." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes bright with emotion. "Your mom sounds like an extraordinary woman." "She was," Emily said softly. "She died 5 years ago. Cancer. But I think about her every day. I think about what she'd do, what she'd want me to do. And I know she'd want me to stand up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." But there was one thing Emily didn't say, one fear she kept locked deep inside where Thomas couldn't see it. She'd done the right thing by speaking up, by helping him, by refusing to be silenced. But doing the right thing didn't always protect you. Sometimes doing the right thing just painted a target on your back and left you vulnerable to people who had no qualms about destroying anyone who got in their way. And as she sat in that expensive study, in that fortified estate, surrounded by security and legal documents and evidence of conspiracy, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still coming. That Marcus and Gerald weren't going to just accept defeat. That somewhere out there, they were planning their next move. And this time, they wouldn't underestimate the waitress who'd ruined everything. The envelope arrived at Emily's old apartment at 9 o'clock in the morning, exactly as David Collier had promised. The delivery person found the note taped to the door, "I don't want your money, and I won't be silenced," written in Emily's shaky handwriting. They took a photo of it, sent it back to their employer, and left the envelope on the doorstep anyway. By 9:30, David Collier had forwarded that photo to Marcus Aldridge. By 10 o'clock, Marcus knew that his carefully constructed plan had completely fallen apart. He sat in his corner office, 60 floors above the city, staring at that photo with an expression that would have terrified anyone who saw it. The pleasant mask he usually wore, the friendly business partner persona he'd perfected over 15 years, was completely gone. What remained was something cold and calculating and absolutely ruthless. Thomas hadn't signed the papers. The waitress hadn't taken the money. And worst of all, Thomas had clearly figured out what was happening, which meant he was probably already building a case, gathering evidence, preparing to fight back. Marcus had spent 3 years on this plan. 3 years carefully engineering Thomas's downfall, creating the perfect storm of financial pressure and legal manipulation that would leave his former friend broken and destroyed. And some nobody waitress had ruined it in 30 seconds by noticing one clause in a document that 8 lawyers had somehow missed, or more accurately, that Gerald Morrison had deliberately hidden in plain sight. He picked up his phone and called Gerald. The lawyer answered immediately, his voice tense. "I assume you've seen the photo." "She refused the money," Marcus said, and his voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd been shouting. "She left us a note saying she won't be silenced, which means Thomas has her. He's protecting her. They're building a case." "We can still contain this," Gerald said quickly. "We destroy the evidence. We make sure no one can prove anything. It's her word against ours, and we have a lot more credibility than a waitress." "There were other lawyers in that room," Marcus interrupted. "Your own associates. They heard you practically confess to conspiracy. Are they all going to stay loyal, or is someone going to grow a conscience and decide to testify against you?" There was a long silence on Gerald's end of the line. "I'll handle my people," he finally said. "But we need to move against Thomas now, before he can formalize anything. We need to discredit him, make him look unstable, unreliable. File complaints with regulatory agencies, leak stories to the press about financial irregularities, create enough noise and confusion that no one knows what to believe." "And the waitress?" Marcus asked coldly. "What do we do about Emily Hartman?" "She's made her choice," Gerald said, and there was something dark in his tone. "She had an opportunity to walk away with $250,000 and a comfortable life. She chose to be an obstacle instead. We treat her accordingly." What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they'd gotten so comfortable in their power that they'd forgotten to be careful, was that Catherine Rodriguez, the private investigator Thomas had hired, was very good at her job. She'd been monitoring David Collier's communications, tracking his movements, building a profile of everyone involved in the conspiracy. And when she saw unusual activity suggesting Marcus and Gerald were planning their next move, she made sure Thomas knew about it immediately. Thomas was in his study when Catherine called, Emily sitting across from him with documents spread across the desk between them. "They're panicking," Catherine said without preamble. "Marcus and Gerald. They're making calls, moving money, trying to cover their tracks. But they're also preparing to go on the offensive. I'm picking up chatter about media leaks, regulatory complaints, character assassination. They're going to try to destroy your credibility before you can expose them." Thomas's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe a day at most," Catherine said. "They're moving fast. If you're going to act, it needs to be now." Thomas looked at Emily, and she saw the decision forming in his eyes. "We go to the authorities," he said. "Today. We bring everything we have, all the evidence, all the documentation, and we make an official complaint before they can muddy the waters. We don't wait for the perfect case. We act now with what we've got." Emily felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Are you sure? If we move too soon, if we don't have enough evidence, they could claim it's all misunderstanding or sour grapes or—" "They're threatening you," Thomas said, and his voice was hard as steel. "They threatened your daughter. They tried to destroy me. They've been manipulating and sabotaging my company for 3 years. We have Gerald's confession. We have financial records showing suspicious transactions. We have testimony from the other lawyers who were in that room. It's not perfect, but it's enough to start an investigation. And once the authorities start looking closely, once they start asking questions and demanding answers, Marcus and Gerald's whole operation will start to unravel." He stood up, reaching for his phone. "Catherine, I need you to compile everything we have into a formal presentation. Everything. The offshore accounts, the financial manipulations, the timeline of sabotage, the bankruptcy document with the fraudulent liability clause, the testimony about Gerald's confession. I want it ready to present to federal investigators within 2 hours." "Already done," Catherine said, and Thomas could hear the smile in her voice. "I've been putting it together for the past day and a half. I'll have it for you in 20 minutes. Thomas turned to Emily. "I need you to write down everything that happened in that conference room. Every detail you remember. What you saw in the document, what you said, how Gerald reacted, what he told me about Marcus's plan. Every word you can remember. It needs to be detailed, specific, and absolutely accurate because they're going to try to discredit you. They're going to say you misunderstood, or you're lying, or you're just trying to get attention. Your testimony has to be unshakable. Emily nodded, her hands already reaching for a legal pad. I remember everything, she said quietly. Every word, every moment. It's burned into my brain. Over the next 2 hours, they worked with an intensity born of desperation and determination. Catherine delivered her compiled evidence, hundreds of pages of documentation cross-referenced and organized into a devastating timeline of conspiracy and fraud. Emily wrote out her testimony, her hand cramping as she filled page after page with precise, detailed descriptions of everything that had happened. Thomas called his new legal team and had them prepare formal complaints to file with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the State Attorney General's office. By noon, they were ready. By 1 o'clock, they were sitting in a federal building downtown, in a conference room with 2 FBI agents and an assistant attorney general, laying out the entire conspiracy from beginning to end. The agents listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to interest to grim determination as the evidence piled up. Financial records that showed millions of dollars moving through suspicious channels. Testimony from junior lawyers willing to testify about what they'd witnessed. Forensic accounting that showed a clear pattern of sabotage and manipulation. And at the center of it all, that bankruptcy document with its fraudulent liability clause, physical proof of an attempt to destroy Thomas Brennan's life through legal manipulation. This is substantial, the Assistant Attorney General said when they'd finished the presentation, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp and focused. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at multiple felony counts. Conspiracy, fraud, attempted theft, potentially RICO charges if we can prove this was an ongoing criminal enterprise. We'll need to verify everything independently, of course, conduct our own investigation, but there's definitely enough here to open a formal inquiry. How long? Thomas asked. How long before you can move against them? The Assistant Attorney General exchanged glances with the FBI agents. We'll want to move quickly before they can destroy evidence or flee. We can have warrants by tomorrow morning, hit their offices and homes simultaneously, seize computers and financial records. But Mr. Brennan, I need to be clear with you. This is going to get ugly. Once we start moving, once warrants are issued and arrests are made, Marcus Aldridge and Gerald Morrison are going to fight back with everything they have. They'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. They'll leak information to the media. They'll try to discredit you and Ms. Hartman and anyone else involved in building this case. You need to be prepared for a long fight. I'm prepared, Thomas said, and there was absolute conviction in his voice. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm seeing this through. The Assistant Attorney General nodded and turned to Emily. Ms. Hartman, you're going to be a key witness in this case. Your testimony about what happened in that conference room, about what Gerald Morrison said, is crucial. But you need to understand that you'll be under intense scrutiny. They're going to investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Any mistakes, any legal issues, anything controversial in your past. Are you prepared for that? Emily thought about Mia, about her daughter's future, about the kind of world she wanted her to grow up in. A world where powerful people faced consequences for their actions, or a world where they got away with destroying lives because no one was brave enough to stand against them. I'm prepared, she said, and her voice was steady despite her fear. I did nothing wrong. I told the truth, and I'll keep telling the truth no matter how hard they try to silence me. If you've ever wondered if one person can really make a difference against powerful enemies, if you've ever questioned whether standing up for what's right is worth the cost, drop a comment and tell me your story. Because this moment right here, this is what it looks like when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated, when they decide that justice matters more than safety. And I want to hear about times you've had to make that choice. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, federal agents were preparing search warrants. By 4 o'clock, surveillance teams were being deployed to watch Marcus Aldridge and Gerald Morrison to make sure they didn't flee or destroy evidence. And by 5 o'clock, when Marcus received a call from a contact in law enforcement warning him that federal investigators were asking questions about him, he realized that his 3-year plan hadn't just fallen apart. It had become the evidence that would destroy him. He'd spent years building a trap for Thomas Brennan, never realizing he was building his own prison. And the cell door was about to slam shut. The raids happened at 6 o'clock the following morning, coordinated strikes on multiple locations simultaneously. Federal agents arrived at Marcus Aldridge's waterfront mansion with search warrants, at Gerald Morrison's law offices with seizure orders, at offshore bank accounts with freeze requests. They moved with the precision of a military operation, boxing in the targets before they had a chance to react or respond. Marcus was still in his bathrobe when the agents knocked on his door, still holding his morning coffee when they handed him the warrant, and began photographing every room in his house. He watched with a carefully controlled expression as they carried out boxes of documents, hard drives, financial records, everything that might contain evidence of a conspiracy he'd spent 3 years building. He didn't resist, didn't protest, didn't say a word. He just stood there in his marble foyer, surrounded by the ruins of his plan, and watched his empire begin to crumble. Gerald Morrison was already at his office when the agents arrived there, having been tipped off by someone in the building who'd seen the federal vehicles approaching. He'd spent the past hour frantically deleting files, shredding documents, trying to destroy evidence before it could be seized. But federal forensic specialists were very good at recovering deleted data, and the shredded documents would be painstakingly reconstructed. Every desperate attempt to cover his tracks just created more evidence of consciousness of guilt, more proof that he knew exactly what he'd done. The news broke by 8 o'clock. Federal investigators raid prominent attorney's office and tech executive's home in fraud probe. By 9 o'clock, it was the top story on every business news channel, with reporters speculating about what the investigation might uncover. By 10 o'clock, Marcus Aldridge and Gerald Morrison had both retained criminal defense attorneys, and the legal battle lines were being drawn. Thomas watched the news coverage from his study, Emily sitting beside him, both of them exhausted but unable to look away. They'd done it. They'd exposed the conspiracy, brought in the authorities, set in motion a chain of events that would hopefully lead to justice. But the Assistant Attorney General had been right. It was about to get ugly. By noon, the counterattack began. Marcus's lawyers held a press conference, portraying their client as a victim of a vindictive former business partner who couldn't accept his own failures. Thomas Brennan is a man whose company was collapsing due to his own poor decisions, the lawyer said smoothly, facing a wall of cameras and microphones. Rather than accept responsibility, he's concocted an elaborate conspiracy theory blaming his partner and his attorney for his own mistakes. The truth will come out, and when it does, Mr. Aldridge will be completely vindicated. Gerald Morrison's firm released a statement calling the investigation a gross miscarriage of justice based on misunderstandings and mischaracterizations of standard legal procedures. They painted Emily as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind, someone who'd been fired for poor performance and was now seeking revenge by making false accusations. The media ate it up. Within hours, there were articles questioning Thomas's credibility, his mental state, his motivations. There were profiles of Emily describing her as a struggling single mother whose daughter's medical bills had left her financially desperate, implying she might be motivated by the hope of a payday. There were opinion pieces debating whether this was a legitimate fraud case or a civil dispute that had been inappropriately criminalized. Emily watched herself being torn apart in the media, watched strangers on television debating her character and her motivations, and she felt physically sick. "They're making me look like a liar," she said, her voice shaking. "Like I'm just trying to get attention or money. They're twisting everything." "That's what they do," Thomas said grimly. "They can't fight the evidence, so they try to destroy the people presenting it. They make it about credibility, about character, about anything except the actual facts of what they did." "Will it work?" Emily asked. "Can they actually get away with this?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'd like to say no, that the truth always wins, that evidence matters more than spin. But I've been in business long enough to know that money and power can buy a lot of doubt. They don't have to prove they're innocent. They just have to create enough confusion that people aren't sure what to believe." Over the next 3 months, the battle continued. Federal investigators built their case methodically, following the money trails, recovering deleted communications, interviewing witnesses. Marcus and Gerald's legal teams fought every step, filing motion after motion to suppress evidence, to dismiss charges, to delay proceedings. The media coverage continued, alternating between damning exposés about the conspiracy and sympathetic profiles of the accused men. But slowly, inevitably, the truth emerged. Forensic accountants traced millions of dollars through the offshore accounts Marcus had used to fund his sabotage operations. Digital forensics recovered emails between Gerald and Marcus discussing their plans, coordinating their strategy, celebrating small victories as Thomas's company weakened. Junior lawyers from Gerald's firm, faced with the choice between loyalty and self-preservation, came forward with testimony about what they'd witnessed and what they'd been asked to ignore. The breakthrough came when David Collier, the smooth-voiced man who'd threatened Emily, made a deal with prosecutors. Facing charges of his own for intimidating a witness, he agreed to testify about his instructions from Marcus and Gerald, providing detailed accounts of the conspiracy from an insider's perspective. His testimony filled in the gaps, connected the dots, transformed the case from suggestive to conclusive. 6 months after Emily had interrupted that meeting, after she'd said, "Please don't sign that," and changed everything, Marcus Aldridge and Gerald Morrison stood in a courtroom facing a judge and a jury. The trial lasted 3 weeks, a parade of financial experts and forensic specialists, and witnesses describing years of calculated betrayal. Emily testified for an entire day, recounting in precise detail what she'd seen and heard in that conference room, and she didn't waver once despite brutal cross-examination from defense attorneys trying to shake her story. Thomas testified about 15 years of friendship betrayed, about trusting someone who was systematically destroying him. Other victims came forward too, people and companies Marcus had targeted in similar schemes over the years, a pattern of predatory behavior that painted a picture of a man who viewed other people as nothing more than obstacles or opportunities. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, fraud, attempted theft, witness intimidation. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd spent 30 years on the bench and seen every kind of white-collar crime imaginable, didn't hide her disgust as she delivered the sentence. "You are educated men from privileged backgrounds who had every advantage and opportunity," she said, looking directly at Marcus and Gerald. "You chose to use those advantages not to build or create, but to destroy someone who trusted you. You spent years plotting to ruin a man's life for your own profit. And when someone had the courage to expose you, you tried to destroy her too. This kind of calculated cruelty, this complete absence of conscience or remorse, demands the maximum sentence allowed by law." Marcus Aldridge was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Gerald Morrison to 15. Both were also ordered to pay millions in restitution and fines, ensuring that even if they ever got out, they'd be financially ruined for the rest of their lives. As the marshals led them away in handcuffs, Marcus looked back one last time at Thomas sitting in the gallery. The hatred in his eyes was absolute, but so was the defeat. He'd gambled everything on destroying his partner, and he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, Thomas and Emily stood together facing a wall of cameras and reporters. "This victory belongs to Emily Hartman," Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. "She's a single mother working 2 jobs who had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. But she did it anyway because she saw something wrong and couldn't stay silent. She's the hero of this story, not me. She's the reason justice was possible." The reporters turned to Emily, shouting questions, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "I just want to say to anyone watching this who's ever been in a situation where they saw something wrong, where they knew they should speak up, but they were scared, I understand that fear. I was terrified. I'm still terrified sometimes. But I learned that silence makes you complicit, that looking away is a choice, and it's the wrong choice. Speaking truth to power is hard and it's scary, and it might cost you things you can't afford to lose. But staying silent costs even more. It costs your integrity, your sense of self, your ability to look at yourself in the mirror. So speak up, even when your voice shakes, even when you're afraid, especially when you're afraid. Because sometimes one voice is all it takes to change everything." 6 months after the trial ended, Emily wasn't working as a waitress anymore. Thomas had hired her as the director of ethics and compliance for his rebuilt company, a role he'd created specifically for her. Her job was to look for problems, to question decisions, to speak up when something didn't seem right. He'd learned the most important lesson of his life. The people who tell you the truth, even when it's hard, even when it costs them, are the people worth keeping close. Those are the people who save you from yourself. Emily's apartment was different now too. She and Mia lived in a real neighborhood, in a place with good schools and safe streets, and neighbors who looked out for each other. Mia was thriving, her laughter filling rooms that had once been defined by stress and fear. And Emily, she had learned something about herself that she'd never quite understood before. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. That speaking up, even when you're terrified, even when the whole world seems stacked against you, could change everything. Not just for the person you help, but for yourself. And Thomas Brennan, the billionaire who'd almost lost everything, who'd been saved by a waitress with a sharp eye and a stronger conscience, he'd learned something too. That success wasn't measured in money or power or empire building. It was measured in the people who stood beside you when everything collapsed, in the voices that spoke truth when lies were easier, in the courage to trust again after betrayal tried to destroy you. So let me ask you one final question. When was the last time you spoke up when something fell wrong? When was the last time you stood up for someone or told the truth even though it was hard, or refused to stay silent even though silence was safer? Drop your story in the comments. Share your moment of courage, no matter how small it might seem, because those moments matter. Those are the moments that change the world, one brave voice at a time. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage doesn't always roar, that sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I'll try again tomorrow," that ordinary people can stand against extraordinary corruption and actually win, then hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories like this waiting to be told. More moments where regular people did extraordinary things. More proof that speaking up matters, that truth matters, that justice is possible when enough people refuse to look away. Thank you for watching this journey with me. Thank you for caring about Emily and Thomas and their fight for justice. And remember, never underestimate the power of speaking up when you see something wrong. Because you might just be the person who changes everything. I'll see you in the next story. Stay brave.